Yo, welcome back to the Shortcut with Jack and Greg. How's it going?
To address the elephant in the room of Jack's insanely high video quality and me recording from my Nokia from 2001. Yeah, I'm actually in Toronto for this episode. I know folks have heard me mention, like, previously had a role at Shopify and was living in Toronto. I'm back, meeting up with some marketing friends, which should be pretty fun. So excuse the downgrade in audio, video.
No. You should just say we've gone global. We've gone international. It's now a globally recognized business that we have here.
I've always heard the rumor of like uploading YouTube videos in certain countries gets you more exposure to people from that country. So send me the file afterwards. I will upload.
Absolutely.
And we build our
Let's try it out. That'll be next episode. The Canadian views. Do you get more Canadian views in Canada?
Skyrocket, yeah. But yeah, no, exciting topic for today. And I think, maybe there's a kind of hidden theme here of like, we're going to be talking about thought leadership, which I think, the substance of which is kind of the main determinant of whether or not it's successful, meaning you can have terrible video quality like I do and still perhaps be successful if the ideas are interesting enough. I'm just teasing. But yeah, we are talking about thought leadership today. I would say thought leadership, like, it comes with nowadays like a lot of baggage for that term. Unfortunately, I think when you use that term, people don't always have like the best, most positive I guess response, or like the first thing that comes to mind isn't necessarily like good content anymore. It's sort of a style that's like attention seeking and this and that. But I do think like thought leadership as a approach, or as like a dimension of your content strategy, like I really can't think of an era where it's maybe even more important. So it's kind of a shame. Maybe we need a new word or new phrase. But I think like the act of sort of producing thought leadership and what that means, which we'll unpack today, like super critical, more important now than it was, frankly, in the past. But I think we should start there. Is like when you and I talk about thought leadership, Wayne talks about thought leadership. We're not talking about 50 slide carousels on LinkedIn that overpromise and underdeliver. Like it really is sort of like the content that you create that tries to influence people, that tries to change their behavior in such a way that it is good for your business. Like that's what we mean when we say thought leadership. And that can be all sort of varying levels of quality. It can be all sorts of different types of execution, all different mediums, but that's really at the heart of like what we mean when we're saying thought leadership.
Right. Yeah, I think to your initial point, yeah, a lot of people hear thought leadership and it's almost become like a cringe trope of like, I don't know, these marketing leaders who are kind of just like posting on Instagram being like, here's how you can make $1 million a month with drop shipping, or like, all that. I feel like, and I'm sure, critically, like the reason why people are now view that as a cringe thing is because it probably was so successful that people started to realize that that was a really impactful way to market. So yeah, we need to reclaim the term because clearly like it does well for a lot of people and companies. It just has gotten maybe a little too far or a little too cringe.
Yeah. And I actually think like if we start with sort of the problems of thought leadership, that's probably a great place to begin, because I think like what you're talking about, maybe one of the root causes of that, like why people act that way, or why the perception of thought leadership has sort of become that, is like a lot of people default to thinking it's like, well, it's led by you, like it's sort of just what you want to put out into the world, what you want to say, your opinions. And when we talk about it, like I think it's really important to say up front, like it's all about your customer. Like when we talk about thought leadership, yes, you are going to sort of be in the driver's seat of coming up with the narratives, with the content ideas and stuff. But there's a really tight feedback loop that needs to happen here, between you and your customer. And the way that you design your thought leadership up front, like what are the talking points, what are the big themes? Again, those all start with your customer. It's not necessarily things you want to put out into the world. I mean, that's for more the personal brand people who are like
Yeah.
going to monetize with courses or whatever later, what I guess. But for companies, for people who really have a business to run, it all starts with the customer. So I would say when I like see thought leadership, I was about to say gone wrong, which sounds like a thought leadership YouTube title. Go awry, let's say. Um, yeah, I think like that tends to be like the root cause. Is like they never really thought about an end user in the first place. So I wanted to kind of give like our perspective, like where do we start with thought leadership? Like how do we see it? Like what does it do? Like what is the job of thought leadership content and all that? So I break it down into kind of like three different things, three different objectives that like thought leadership content needs to sort of achieve like over time. I think the first and most important, and again, this starts with your customer, is that like exposure to thought leadership content, like customers or prospects who are reading what you write, watching what you produce, and so on and so on. Over time, they should end up with a shared point of view with you. So you end up both, you and your customer, you end up both believing the same things. And that shared belief actually changes their behavior, right? So you put something out in the world, they see it through a blog post at first, and then a video series you do on it, and then a series of tweets from your founder. And over time, they sort of say, I've never thought of it that way, but that's how it is. You're right. I agree. And they start from different places. Sometimes they start with like, well, I didn't have an opinion on this at all, or I actually thought the opposite, and they sort of come over to your side. But sometimes they actually start pretty much in alignment, and it really all this is doing is just like now they're doubled down. They're really in. They really agree. And again, as a result of this belief of like this is how things work, their behavior starts to change. So this is a very, very super simple high level one, just to not pick something complicated. But like we obviously believe like really deeply in video sort of being a driving factor for your content strategy. Of course, like the things that we produce, like we would hope that over time people would be bought in and agree with that. But it actually needs to show up in like the change in behavior. So for the first quarter, a separate video strategy gets proposed, or there's more people thinking about video podcasting, or there's more people considering video as their anchor medium, and so on and so on. Like, we can't say that we're successful unless some sort of behavior changes, and neither can you, for anybody considering this. The second part of that is that this change in behavior, this thing that you get people to do more often, that you get to consider in the first place or to start, it should make them a stronger fit for your product. So to kind of TLDR instant replay this here, you get them to believe something that you believe, they start to change their behavior, and as a result of that, they are now a better fit for the product that you sell. And I believe this was from Kathy Sierra in her book, Making Users Awesome. But a sort of one-liner on this that I've always liked is like, the reason that you do that is that it's easier to sell a product to somebody who has already bought the problem. They already believe that a problem exists. They already believe that there's some opportunity that they don't have yet. And so it's much easier to sell a product to somebody who's in that state of mind, right? And so thought leadership content, the whole point is to get them there, get them to that point. They believe, yes, we do need to invest in video. Yes, we do need a new way to approach analytics. Yes, we do need X, Y, Z, right? And then your product starts to make much more sense. And then I think the third part of thought leadership, and the last sort of like component of it, is that you paint a little bit of a picture of like the landscape of, this is not just one-on-one. This is not just like we're telling you this and there's nothing else going on in the kind of market overall or in the community overall. You need to kind of paint the picture of like, hey, here's some of the broad like market trends, things happening in our space that are sort of like driving this change, right? And that gives them this like sense of the stakes. It gives them the sense of urgency, right? So it's not just us trying to convince you in isolation. It's actually, here are your peers responding to this. Here's the data that shows that this is happening. Here's kind of the arc of like how things used to be and where they're headed based off of that. It's just that bigger context that lets them know, they're not just getting marketing messages from some company with a biased point of view in isolation. You got to give them that, like, you got to give them that surrounding context that says this is happening.
Give them the evidence.
Yeah, but yes, exactly. And like, again, like, show the stakes, I think is a big part of that. It's like, okay, great, but like, what happens if I do nothing? There needs to be an answer to that. And hope, I mean, if you're going to put these messages out there in the first place, hopefully that answer is like, well, if you don't do anything at all, that's a problem. You should do something. Like, that's why we're telling you about it. Right. So that, I think, is like where we definitely try to start with thought leadership, is like, if we can't reasonably come up with answers, or if we can't see how our content does those jobs, it's like, why are we producing it? Like, so that you think we're interesting and cool and we have original thoughts? Like, that's not enough. Like, that is important for the individual standalone pieces of content that you make to be interesting enough to like engage with and watch and so on. But it's not like it's not a strategy for thought leadership. Like, the last way I would encourage people to like maybe think about this and frame this is kind of like something my old boss used to ask me, is like, well, what happens if you get everything you want? Like, meaning, like, with thought leadership, like, what happens if you were to get a prospect, someone, to watch and read everything? Like, what would you want to change? And if your answer to that is like, I don't know, or just they would find us interesting and hopefully trustworthy, like, my point of view, my argument would be, that's not enough. Like, what should really change, if you really got everything you want and somebody engaged with everything that you produced, you should really be changing their behavior. They should really be doing a lot of things different because of you, because you prompted the change, right? So that, I think, is like really, I think, the root of like really effective thought leadership content.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's also like different ways to do thought leadership. I think a lot of people imagine, when we start talking about it, that it like has to be you, or that you have to start, making your own, long LinkedIn posts or Twitter threads or whatever. But a lot of times, like in our case at Kapwing, like, I feel like probably our biggest, most consistent thought leadership is actually us running it for someone else, us running it for our CEO, who, was down to let us, make video content starring her. And so I think it's also important to note, like, there's like so many different ways to do thought leadership that don't feel, that you can flex, and it doesn't have to be on your own accounts. It doesn't have to be, if you feel strange about it or something, as long as you can get someone to try it, it's probably worth a try. Like, this is an example of like some of the stuff we've created for our CEO's channel on LinkedIn.
And I think you're getting at a good point, that like, no one person or one channel like shoulders the responsibility of like thought leadership. Like, it's this is probably to save for another day, but it's like, it actually goes even beyond the marketing team. Like, yes, the marketing team should really have their reins on like these narratives and like how they're going to approach thought leadership. But thought leadership is really like, it's your company's point of view. And it really is a company-wide thing. It's something that everybody has to get bought into, because let's say, for instance, you end up, again, the question, what if you get everything you want? What if you're successful? You get people to believe all of these things, but the product doesn't actually reflect what you've been putting out there. You say, like, if we were to produce all of this content around repurposing and atomization and its importance and like ROI in video, and then that were something that was not easy to do in Kapwing, makes no sense, right? It makes no sense at all. So the whole company really needs to be like bought in. to these ideas. Like at the very least, I would say let's be realistic, because I know it's not always like that's not always the case. It's not always easy to do right at the outset. At the very least, like the marketing team needs to take cues from what the product is really great at, right?
Right.
Another example of like thought leadership is not go meditate in a cave and come up with thoughts that lead. It's like, no, what is happening in the space? What is our product really excellent at? And like, what are things that we really want like customers to believe,
Yeah. We do thought leadership on so many different channels, I think, actually, or we try to. Yeah, LinkedIn, we make YouTube videos about it. We do TikToks. In a way, it's not just text posts, things like that. I think there's like so many different ways to lead. And I also think like if you do have a not larger, but even if you have a marketing team of any size, that's larger than one person, everyone can sort of find a way to contribute to this, and you never know what's gonna like stick. And yeah, I think thought leadership, a lot of times you think of it as like the guy on the podcast microphone that's making like clips, you know what I mean? And it doesn't have to necessarily be like that.
No, it could show up in really any medium, right? And it's like, I think, well, one, we're going to just move right past the fact that I believe you're wearing the same shirt today as you were in the video that we just looked at, but
actually filmed it and posted it today.
Sure.
Yeah, so that makes sense.
Thought leadership's all about being consistent with ideas and attire, actually.
Right. Yeah, well, it's a subconscious thing, over almost 6,000 people saw that video. Now that I'm wearing this, they're gonna click the thumbnail if I'm wearing the same green shirt, because they're gonna remember me.
Absolute 5D chess move, months in the making. But yeah, like to your point, like, I think like something we see a lot too is like this recent sort of attention. There's a lot of attention being given to repurposing. Yes, thought leadership and repurposing are two different things that you have to figure out. But one thing I think like really, like one way they really complement each other, right, is if you nail down your sort of talking points, your thought leadership talking points, then you have much more confidence. It's like a really great guardrail almost, to make sure that like all this other content that you end up remixing and getting out there, it stays on task. Like it stays all aligned to getting people to believe and see the world the way that you see it, right? And I think like personally, since we've kind of tried to invest in more of a framework, like what are our main talking points? How are we going to map things out for repurposing? I do feel like it's been getting easier, at least for us. I mean, I would definitely like I want to hear, Jack, how you see it, but I know for me personally, like just having kind of our main themes like laid out, it does make it a lot simpler of like, okay, well, we're going to come back to these main wells and we're going to come up with different ideas that help really unpack these points of view that we have from like many different ways and many different formats. And I mean, I think like it's naturally made that process a bit easier, because it's always easier to start with something that is a blank page. And more so, like even more than that, I would say it's just given me a lot more confidence that like we're getting the right messages out there over and over, rather than like kind of a smorgasbord of messages, some of which relate to the product and some of which don't,
Yeah, I definitely think that's true. I think having sort of certain narratives or sort of, just things to come back to or to lead you when you're brainstorming is really important, for just making sure that when you are like trying to influence someone, because I feel like a lot of times with thought leadership, you're not like actively being like, well, try out our product, right? It's more of like a long game that you're betting on. And so I think, you really have to like convince people of what you've been saying the entire time, which is that, there's just like, you have to sell them on the problem. And if you're not talking about that problem, then they're definitely, and you're not talking about the product, they're definitely not going to find their way. I also feel like it's important, like, this is obvious probably, but maybe still worth saying, is like, thought leadership, you kind of have to have a pretty deep understanding of what you're talking about. Like, it's maybe going to be a waste of time if you aren't sort of deeply ingrained in the community or the tech of what you're talking about. Like, in my opinion, like, we have like different thought leaders right now at Kapwing. You know, I make thought leadership pieces sometimes about video because that's what I know. Like, you probably are best equipped to make thought leadership posts about, you know, SEO, and our coworker Megan is probably best equipped to make thought leadership about written content and blogs and things like that. And so I think it's and our CEO definitely about, you know, several of those things. But yeah, I feel like unless you really feel like you're saying something interesting and that it connects to sort of those those like key areas that you've identified as your narratives, like, it's just not going to hit home, and it's kind of a waste of time.
Yeah, definitely. And I think like I said, the end game for all of this is you're still measuring channels based off of like your channel specific metrics, right? Like thought leadership doesn't really have a single sort of North Star outside of this, like over time through all of this content that you put out there, that your messaging is consistent and that you convince people of the right things, right? I think that's another reason why people find this like a little bit trickier to manage than some things that are a little more clean cut in marketing, especially even within content. And then also like the other point I'll make is thought leadership doesn't have to be something cut and dry like category creation. I often see people, I think, conflate the two things. So category creation, if folks haven't heard of that, is sort of like owning sort of a word or a phrase that represents like this new way of doing things, like very classically like HubSpot with inbound marketing and things like that. That is a sort of a aspect or a dimension of thought leadership. It's something you can do to make your point of view clearer, you know, instead of saying it's this new thing where you kind of have customers come inbound via content. You sort of just make up a phrase that captures it all. But I just want to emphasize that that's not, that you don't have to approach it that way. Like just having a point of view, a point of view that's pointed, that people can disagree with, that really feels like it's reflected in your product, like that's plenty. That is a lot to work with. So don't conflate the two, and don't view the ways that like big companies pursue thought leadership with major campaigns and these like branded own terms that they try to come up with what you can do, which is like literally just start with a point of view. Like, and speaking of like, you know, how do you sort of come up with these like points of view or narratives, if you would like to use that term? Unfortunately, a lot of the words in this space all seem like they, you know, they're either like ambiguous or they're sort of like cloudy in their meaning. But yeah, how do you come up with your, let's say, talking points, right? If narratives or points of view are not precise enough, literally, let's just say your talking points. Like, what are your talking points for thought leadership going to be? I would say that I think of like three different places to start, where I would like just ask questions. So again, don't try to zen out and just like come up with something. Just ask a couple questions and literally answer your own questions and see where that takes you. So the first sort of category of questions would be like, what's changing? Like what is changing in your space, in your industry right now? So for us, it would be sort of the changing state of video marketing, of short form video. You can kind of do adjacent topics too, of short form video, of organic social, and so on and so on. Like all these things that our sort of product touches. Like what is just happening in the space? I mean, specifically, I would ask like, you know, like what are some new and nascent kind of like concepts or like strategies that you've seen a lot of people talk about? Like what are some things that are maybe getting traction? What are some old ways? I like to kind of do the opposite. Like, what are some old approaches, old ways that are starting to really lose their luster? Like, they really don't seem to be as effective as they once were, or you really need to think about them differently. And then I think too, like, like you don't turn into full-time analyst here, but you know, the broad like changes that we we all know, for instance, in that space, we know that referral traffic from social way down. We have some data points around video performance. We have some data points around video preference from consumers. Like, that data is really helpful. It helps you understand the story. It helps you understand what's going on long before you do any marketing. Like, it,
Yeah.
first and foremost, it just helps you get your head wrapped around like what actually is changing. Like, you need to get to the truth first before you come up with marketing pitches and messaging, right? So that's when I would definitely start with like what is changing. I think another one though, if you're in a space that like maybe is, you know, doesn't feel as choppy at the moment, I would ask questions around like what is wrong, like what are people doing wrong, or what do people misunderstand, even if it's stuff that's like it's not really seeing a shakeup at the moment, but you really in your heart of heart believe like people misunderstand this. They're causing themselves like a bunch of undue misery by doing things this way. They're following this best practice that is like anything but a best practice.
Yeah.
Like, it's like a worst practice disguised as like a best practice, you know?
Yeah.
So that would
Those
be
are
my
perfect hooks for videos. I feel like I can see it in my head of the first 5 seconds. That's the line that grabs them.
we all want to know, right? It's like,
Yeah.
because I mean, but more maybe than even being brilliant, like all of us want to not be like doing something stupid. Like,
Yeah.
more than being the most brilliant at something, it's like I would just love to not make a mistake.
Yeah.
So that's probably why those have a lot of appeal, but it's also, they're just great questions to ask when, again, you think that, you know, maybe something happening in the market or something happening in this kind of like bigger macro sense isn't actually driving the change. It's just literally like a bunch of people have come to misunderstand this concept over time, and they're just doing things the wrong way. And we're going to show you how to do things the right way. And like, better yet, like our product is going to be built in such a way that it makes it easier to do things the right way, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So that's a really, really great place to begin too. I also think kind of like, I think this one is kind of like this third and final one that I think about is definitely kind of adjacent to like market shifts, but maybe it sort of like maybe it brings those two things together. But I do think like a picture of the future is sort of like an interesting place to ask questions too. Just sort of like, what will the future look like? You know, if you believe like, I think that maybe a good example of this is like, would be for us, like the intersection of AI and video. I think like, yes, it sort of is fairly like something that's changing. I think that there are instances of people perhaps viewing or using AI the wrong way in video production. But I also think it does feel kind of distinct from those two as well. It does feel a little bit more like imaginative, predictive, of like just
Yeah.
where's the puck going to go next, right? So yes, I think it has bits and pieces from the previous two, but I do think like what truly is the future going to look like here is kind of a separate and third thing. And so, yeah, I think like asking questions of like, what will we never, ever, ever go back to? Like, what is fundamentally in the rearview mirror? Or like, once this sort of whole new way, this whole new model, this fundamentally new thing starts to become commonplace, like, what does the world look like? Or what's better about the world because of that? Right.
Right.
So those are three just like areas I come back to when it's like we have some customer intel, but we also want to incorporate like what our own perspective is. I ask these questions to like help kind of come up with those talking points. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think if you watch a lot of our pieces, they do answer these questions. Like a lot of what we talk about is, like the future of video creation and also what's wrong with video creation now, why it's so tough for professionals, why it's so tough for people who've never learned how to make video like traditionally. The future of AI, it's all using these questions to guide us. So if you want to see some evidence of this in action, you know where to find it.
Yeah. I mean, I think, this, we didn't touch on this, but this is kind of like, this is more of an integrity thing than anything, but it's like also, preach what you practice. Like maybe that's like that should be sort of a universal truth of thought leadership is like, and again, we try, like we try really to stick with that and to live up to that. Don't go too far with thoughts being way out in front of like what your team is actually doing.
Yeah.
Again, I don't mean to say that like your marketing team can't make predictions about things or it can't analyze things, but um, you do have to be careful to like I think not get that reputation that a lot of like social media thought leaders have, which is they're
Yeah.
all sizzle and no steak. So sometimes, like for instance, I've been in positions where we come up with a really strong sort of market point of view. There's a lot of buy-in. There's buy-in across marketing. There's a belief from like the product team that this is also true, but it's not reflected in the product yet. So you might have to sort of work on like the timing of like, okay, we
Mhm.
have a great point of view on this now, but we have to get the timing right. Let's not publish some long, lengthy, super opinionated, no holds bar, thought leadership at a time where our product actually isn't reflecting this new kind of point of view that we're developing,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think if there were a sort of like a single one liner that applies to any kind of thought leadership campaign is like, you know, preach what you practice rather than the reverse.
Mm. Love that. Love that. Um, yeah, I think another thing to note is like more and more as I've gotten that time and time again already, but like the cringiness that people view, I think a lot of thought leadership, I think can like a way to do away with that too is to make sure that you're actually bringing in like evidence of what you're talking about.
Hmm.
A lot of times people, I think, sort of even go too far, preaching too much, but they don't have actually like the
Yeah.
grounded data, or even anecdotes to back up really what they're saying. They kind of just say things without actually explaining, or just saying like sort of inflammatory things that they think people to try to get people to buy into something more so out of
Yeah.
like maybe fear or out of FOMO or whatever, rather than because of like an informed decision, which I think
Yeah.
only really takes you so far and sort of paints you as that cringy figure.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, to wrap it up, also like when you are asking these questions, also making sure that you're um, providing examples that make people buy into it, not because you're telling them to, but because you're just relaying information that like is
Yes.
valuable and that they should know.
Yes. There's like, like on the spectrums of like evidence required, right? When you're selling to even remotely sophisticated customers, like really thought leadership is supposed to just be an articulation of like proof. Like
Yeah.
the thought leadership part of it, I suppose, or the thought maybe applied is like the way that you structure the argument and the content, the way that you weave it all together. But it should be, built on top of a foundation of like evidence. It's really just like you're you're sort of collecting the evidence, you're collecting your own anecdotes and examples, your own experiences, the data that's out there, and then you weave it together and you prove what you're saying. Versus the other spectrum where I suppose like no one needs any evidence at all is like thought leadership about which side the toilet paper should be facing, like up or down. You know what I mean? Like the points that you argue about with your friends, like, and that
Hmm.
that again, I think is another calling card of like thought leadership content that annoys most people, at least in the professional context. Like that's how it comes across. It comes across as like there's some big debate, but there's absolutely no evidence, or it's about something that
Yeah.
really doesn't matter whether it's option A or option B. Whereas, like, again, really effective thought leadership that's about getting customers is like it feels very tightly wound. It feels very well supported. It's like it's a fortress. It houses the idea in a really strong structured way. Whereas a lot of the stuff you see on social media is like a Jenga tower in the wind. I mean, it's just ready to fall over.
Yeah. Yeah. And people, I think, are seeing past that now.
Yes,
That
totally.
era is over. So don't
Let's
get
hope.
caught up in that. Yeah, well, I think that about wraps up our conversation on thought leadership. So make sure to go think and lead, and I'm sure you'll do great. Um, It's really as simple as that.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much for watching. Yet again, we're here every week. Make sure to come back for the shortcut and let us know what you think about. Have you ever done any thought leadership? Are you planning on it? Or let us know what you want us to talk about next week. We're always open to new ideas to talk about. So,
Yeah.
Greg, it's been a pleasure. Enjoy
Always.
Canada.
Yeah. Yep.
And I'll see you next time.
All right, y'all. Take care.